if you think about somebody who is pregnant, going through labor, breastfeeding, that is truly one of the most vulnerable times of your life. You feel so open. I mean, you are literally naked. You're literally exposing yourself, but also you are between life and death potentially. And your baby is as well. And you want people who will help you and take care of you. And if there is somebody who disregards your needs or things that are specific to your background, or who is dismissive, or who openly despises you, you're not going to feel safe. Some people physically cannot give birth unless they feel safe.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. This is the Science Chick Report, and I am Dr. Kathleen Kendall-Tackett. And today I am very, very pleased to have Dr. B.J. Woodstein with us, who is the author of a brand new book called Be Fruitful, The Jewish Pregnancy and Birth Guide. So first of all, this is a phenomenal book. I really would encourage all of you to get a copy of it. But I hope that you'll be inspired by the conversation that we're going to have about it, because I think it's a very timely topic and it's really important. So I want to say, thank you and for joining us today, BJ. I really appreciate it. You're very, very welcome to be here. And I'm really very interested in what you have to say.
Thank you so much. I'm really pleased to be here and to be talking to you.
So I think, a question that you raised right in the beginning is kind of when you talked about why you wrote this book, because I think people would ask, okay, so why do Jewish women need a separate guide? And what could be the thing? And so, what was the impetus for you writing this book?
Well, sadly, I guess I would say that my impetus was anti-Semitism and increasing amounts of anti-Semitism. And this was even happening before the 7th of October, that as a doula and a lactation consultant, I was experiencing it in the birth world. And I knew lots of other people who were experiencing it in the birth world. It didn't feel like the health profession was necessarily a safe place for Jewish patients. And some of that was intentionally malicious, but much of it, I would argue, was probably stemming from ignorance, where people just didn't know enough about what Jews are and what Jews need as patients or as pregnant women or breastfeeding people. So they couldn't support them properly. But then after the 7th of October, anti-Semitism increased by huge amounts. I mean, some studies have shown, 300% increase, 500% increase. Obviously depends a little bit on where you're taking your statistics from and who you're interviewing and so on. But more and more stories kept coming out about Jewish people trying to get care and either maybe being turned away or not getting kind care or not getting culturally competent care. And I personally found that the doula world in particular was really hostile to Jews, Jewish doulas, but also Jewish patients and Jewish clients. And I ended up having to leave the doula groups that I was in, which means that, I'm not getting work, but that's a slightly different matter. But because of that, I started to speak to other Jewish doulas and other Jewish lactation consultants and other Jewish midwives. And I found that they were all experiencing very similar things. So that was kind of a long answer, but basically what I wanted to say is I was thinking about it even before the 7th of October, wanting to help educate people. And really that galvanized me. And I felt now is the time we need this book. People need to access this information and this support.
Well, the thing that's kind of interesting is, I think prior to October 7th, if we had, seen a book with a cover like this, we would have thought, okay, this is how you work with people in the Orthodox or the ultra-Orthodox. I think that's what people would think.
Yes.
But what, I found in talking to people, and especially since, your book came out and I've been talking to people about it and stuff, and it's like I've been hearing these horrendous stories.
Yeah.
And I think I have to admit, I am actually flabbergasted by it. I know it's true because I've heard it from so many places. But,
yes.
in the university world, honestly, and you probably know this too, I mean, it was simmering.
Yes.
They had that BDS movement, on university campuses. And, Even back when I worked at Stanford, which is talking about the 80s, it was already kind of cooking, but it was sort of there and it was in the background. But this overt stuff is stunning to me. And the fact that it's gotten to be so hostile that you don't even feel like you can get care, that's frightening. Somebody actually just recently told me a story about, she was afraid that a loved one was not going to get life-saving care
Mm.
because of the way that, the technician in the situation was acting. I mean, and she was already frightened because of
That
just the situation. And then to add that and to think that you can't even get this and, to have you be shunned in the professional world
mm.
is stunning to me. I mean, it's not, I know it's true. I know what you're telling me is true, but it's just, it blows my mind. I mean, how did we get here?
Yeah, but that's a huge question, isn't it? I mean, I think because, like you, I have an academic background and I worked at a university for much of my career, and there was so much anti-Semitism, some of it quite overt, and some of it subtle. And, just speaking, I can tell you a personal story that at one point I did go to human resources at the university where I worked, and I said, look, all these things are happening. There were a couple people in particular who were making comments who would say things like, "Oh, we don't want to hire any Jews in our department." They would say those kinds of things. And the human resources manager said to me, "Well, I think you've got a chip on your shoulder about being Jewish, and I suggest you move on with your life and draw a line under it." And that was kind of the limit of what they would do. And because of those kinds of experiences, I co-founded a Jewish staff and student group at the university where I worked. And there was so much resistance to us founding that. The I mean, that's a whole different topic, but people felt, why do you need that? And what's special about you or what's different about you? And we were thinking, well, because you're treating us the way you're treating us, we need a place to go. And I think it's been so difficult because obviously we could talk about the years of, anti-Semitic
Right.
tropes and
Yeah.
myths
Yeah.
and, centuries, millennia perhaps. Um, and I think that there's so much of that still built into our society in so many ways. And the past few years have enabled people to say things that previously they might have only thought or they might have, said, but in private, and now they're saying it publicly. And if you say, "Oh, but that's really hurtful," or "That's upsetting," or "That feels like you're inciting violence against me," they will actually say, "You're being too sensitive," or "I can say what I want. You can't tell me what to say." And I guess that's, along the lines of the HR manager saying to me, "You've got a chip on your shoulder." That's what they're saying. You've got a chip on your shoulders, your collective shoulders about, being Jewish. I feel like that's what we're being told by society. And you also said about, many people would think, "Oh, this is about the Orthodox." And certainly I do say things in the book that are specifically about the Orthodox, but actually, Judaism is such a huge
It's
spectrum.
absolutely.
But some of the things that I talk about in the book affect people who even would identify as atheist
Yeah.
Jews.
Yeah.
Um, so, we go along this kind of this range, the spectrum from, really humanist Jews all the way up to the most religious, the most observant. And yet we're all finding that, people are prejudiced against us, are discriminating against us because of our surnames, because of how we look, because of our cultural, ethnic, religious background. And I do want to believe the best of people. I don't think that most people intend to do harm. And I especially don't want to think that about those in the medical profession, because what are you there to do as a lactation consultant, for
Right.
example? You
Right.
want to help people breastfeed. You presumably have gotten into that career because you're passionate about it, or you've chosen to be a doctor, or a clinical psychologist, or whatever it might be, because you care about humans and helping them improve their lives. And yet to then say, "Well, I'm not going to give you good care because of your background," that it kind of
Yeah.
blows my mind, frankly.
Actually, it blows my mind that that person who was trying to hire people could say that to you. How is that even legal? Could you imagine saying that to any other group? Oh,
No,
you know what? We don't really want any black people in our department. I mean, how
no.
would that go?
I don't think that would be acceptable. I think people would really rise up and do something about that. And actually, there was, it may not have reached the news in the US yet, but, or maybe it won't at all, but I live in the UK, and
Right.
in the news just this week, a tube driver, so on a train in
Mhm.
London,
Right.
was asked, what would you do if you had, Jews on your tube that you were driving, your tube driver? And he said, no Jews will be safe on any tube that I'm driving. And he was captured on video saying that really openly, blatantly, and he's still in possession of a job. And, again, like the question that you asked, if he had said that about any other group of people, people would be up in arms saying, what does that mean? Are you suggesting you would do violence? You might run over somebody from that group? I mean, if he'd said that, let's just say about a Hindu person,
Right.
yeah, nobody would think that that was okay. But somehow it was kind of, well, yes, what do you expect, you Jews? That's kind of the perspective these days.
It's just talking. I mean, it's got to feel like you don't feel safe.
Absolutely. And I think that's one reason why I'm so eager to increase people's cultural competence, because
Right.
I don't want people to feel unsafe. I don't want people to feel frightened. If you think about somebody who is pregnant, going through labor,
Right.
breastfeeding, that is truly one of the most vulnerable times of your life. You feel, so open,
Right.
and I mean, you are
Mhm.
literally naked.
Yeah.
You're literally exposing yourself, but also, you are between life and death
Yeah.
potentially,
You are.
and your baby is as well. And you want people who will help you and take care of you. And if there is somebody who, disregards your needs, or things that are
Mhm.
specific to your background, or who's dismissive, or who openly despises you, you're
Yeah.
not going to feel safe. Some people physically cannot give birth
Right.
unless they feel safe. I mean, when I say some people, I mean the majority of
Yeah.
people. You have to feel safe. And if you've got somebody who's wearing, badges with slogans,
Mhm.
pins on their shirt, if you've seen them outside the hospital protesting, and then they come in and they're treating you, that is really frightening for people. And I don't want someone to be frightened about going to give birth or getting support with
Right.
lactation, when you should be focusing on what ideally would be an exciting, momentous, joyous occasion in your life.
The thing is, I think I listened to like what you're describing, what's going on, and I've heard this, talking about in Europe, kind of in general, this huge rise. And, I know, thinking about history, I think a question starts getting to be, when do I leave?
Well, exactly. Yes. I can tell you that I was about to say the majority, but let's say close to the majority of Jewish people that I know here in the UK, and some that I know in the US, are thinking of exit strategies. We
Yeah.
are all kind of putting plans in place for if it gets worse, because in all honesty, without making it sound extreme, for many of us, it feels like, is this Germany in the 1930s? Are people so against me that one day it's going to be too late and I won't be able to leave? I
Right.
won't, and where do we go? Where will I be safe? Um, for people who have jobs, can I transfer my job? Do I have the skills? What about my children? Will I be able to take them to a new school? It's all those kinds of questions. But it's, in all honesty, I had a friend, a non-Jewish friend, who said to me, I will hide you and your family if it's necessary. That was her promise to me. And you're thinking, well, Anne Frank, that was so many
Right.
years ago, but it's not. It's kind of here again to a certain extent, where people are starting to think, what's going to happen? Is somebody going to, come to my home and hurt me? You
Because
know?
I mean, that's the thing, it's like in so many of the stories, from the 30s and stuff, there were people who were like, no, this could never happen here.
Mhm.
I've been a citizen. This is like I think about Vienna.
Mm,
Vienna, this cosmopolitan city,
absolutely.
very open. Franz Jovis has invited Jewish people to come, and the
Yes.
culture flourished as a result. And then all of a sudden, you know, the Nazis come in and take over the city without a shot. And it's
Mm,
like, what happened? And some
yes.
people saw it coming, but I think the majority kept thinking, "Yeah, this is a civilized place. It's not going to happen."
Yeah, because you think, well, I'm assimilated, I'm part of
Right.
society, I'm
Right.
contributing, I work, I pay my taxes, you know, I go to cultural events, my children are in school with non-Jewish children, that is my life as well.
Right.
And so it's kind of horrifying to think, could this happen again? And so, as I said, many Jewish people I know are preparing for that
Yeah.
eventuality. And that's a scary way to be living our
Well,
lives.
and I think it's, especially as you said, at such a vulnerable time
Mm,
during that whole sort of transition of pregnancy and birth and postpartum. I mean, that is such a vulnerable time, as you said.
yes.
You know, labor certainly, but I mean, really postpartum when you have this baby and you're thinking, what am I going to do? I mean, that is really, I think, it's stunning that you're getting this kind of thing in the professional community. And you know what? I know you're telling me accurately because I think I mentioned to you last time, it's a psychology is getting this big audit,
Mm, yes.
because what's been happening, and it's funny because we're a large professional society. We have 100, I think 90,000 members.
Oh, wow. That's
And
big.
we have a lot of Jewish members, and
Mm,
yet people on the listservs in the divisions are just spouting stuff,
mm,
and I mean, I've had people that are even, fairly tough, you know,
mm.
especially I have several colleagues from Israel, and they're just kind of like, nah, they're just pretty tough. And they're like, I'm scared to go to the convention,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know, and it's like,
Definitely.
and like APA was deaf because they think we're tolerant, we could be, I mean, that's their whole thing, and diverse voices and all this stuff. And they were stunned to find out the Congress was investigating them
Mm.
because some complaints made it there. And I thought, wow. And I thought, yeah, have seen it, definitely.
Yes. But you know what I think part of the problem is that Jewish people are really caught between different kind of positions. Lots
Right,
of people think, oh, those Jews, they're white, they're
right,
privileged, they're rich, they've got all the power. Most of the things not true. And most Jews don't, or many Jews don't even identify as white or wouldn't
right,
look like what you think of as white. So you've got this position where it's like, okay, those Jews are like, top of society.
right,
Why do they need any special privileges? And they deserve to have people criticizing them. And then you have this other position of Jews are beneath us, they're worse than us.
right.
It's kind of back to the United States. When you think of early immigration and signs would say,
Oh, yeah,
no blacks, no Irish, no Jews,
right,
that
right,
kind of thing. And so it's kind of, and it's like, well, which one are we? Are we, and
right,
the reality is, of course, we're neither.
right.
We're some, just like all people, we've got good Jews, bad Jews. We've got, all sorts. And you've got Jews who maybe look white and would happily accept white privilege. And you've got Jews who are, have the darkest skin tones, everything in
Yeah,
between.
and
And
everything in
yet most
between.
people don't recognize that. And so they will, I think that's why your organization was so shocked to hear that they were being investigated, because they probably thought, well, Jews can't be discriminated against, or like,
Right.
what's the problem for Jews? There's
Well,
nothing going on there.
and I think that was the thing. I think it really, and the CEO, who is actually a good guy. I mean, he is, he African American, but he's been in the trenches, unlike a lot of
Mhm.
these folks that have been kind of up in the tower.
Yes.
This guy's been in the trenches working, in kind of really, impoverished neighborhoods and stuff like this. So I mean, he's really got some, well, shall I say, street cred, on
Yes.
this. And, I think he has honestly really tried to be, open and, have discussions. And, sometimes it gets very contentious because the needs of this group conflict with this group, I mean, but he's navigated this. And I think he just thought, okay, well, we're doing well. But I
Yeah.
mean, there was just this uncontrolled torrent of stuff. I'd sat in meetings and thought, and one of my friends actually sat in a meeting. She goes, "Oh my God, I wish you'd been there because it was so horrendous." And again, had decided to take a side, you know, without kind of any balance at all, in the October 7th question. I mean, and
No.
she was trying to point out, look, this is very one-sided. And I mean, people lost it and there was yelling going on.
I mean, they probably jumped on her and
Jumped
thought,
on her. And
yeah.
she was just like, "Whoa." And she goes, "Oh my gosh." I said, "I wish I'd been there too." Because I mean, that was terrible. So this
Mhm.
actually does bring up kind of a question because we've kind of danced around this a little bit.
Mm.
So you've talked about, kind of, what are the identities of Jews or what are Jews?
Yeah,
Because this is something I think people are very confused about. They think it's kind of
definitely.
this one little group that, goes to vacation in the Catskills.
Yeah. I think that stuff, I think absolutely when you say Jew to many people, they get a certain picture in their head. And I think Catskills and humor
Yeah.
might be one of those things. Another thing would be they think of a big bearded man,
Right.
with the hat, and a long black garment. But
And the
that's
girls,
such, and yeah, exactly,
yeah,
the side locks, and that is a tiny, tiny
tiny,
percentage of Jews, and most people don't recognize that. So the way I like to think about it is because people assume Jews are always religious, and it's a
right,
religious group. I like the term an ethno-religion
right.
because we're an ethnicity and a religion. Some people focus more on one side versus the other, and some people really kind of bring both together. And as I said before, you can find Jews who are extremely observant, and you can find Jews who are not observant at all, and everything in between. You find a lot of Jews who don't necessarily believe in a God, but who like to go to synagogue because it's a chance to meet other Jews, it's community, it's kind of tradition. They like the celebrations, they like the holidays. And of course, you will find people who go religiously, so to speak, every Shabbat and even sometimes during the week. Jews come from every part of the world. So obviously, originally, we're from what's now called Israel.
Right.
And then for various reasons, some people left and many were expelled. And we kind of ended up in different areas.
Well, yeah,
And
the Romans, I think, had something to do with that.
yeah, absolutely. They were definitely involved.
Yeah.
And Jews have been expelled from many countries
Mhm.
over the years, which is
Like
very unfortunate. So it's kind
Spain,
of,
England, yeah.
yeah, the city that I live in England, which is called Norwich, was the first one to expel Jews, actually, in the 13th
I was
century.
going to say, wasn't it like 1320 when there was
It was,
expellation? Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. So, it was a long time ago. Some of us are still bitter, maybe. But, and then Jews have kind of gone and lived everywhere, and we're kind of a migrating people, although for many Jews, we still think of Israel as the homeland, our
Right,
native
right.
place. Um, right now, there are about 15 million Jews in the world, which is tiny compared to many other groups.
Absolutely.
And about half of that, so around 7 million, live in Israel. And a similar number live in the United States because the US is kind of a big place for Jews. And then there are many Jews elsewhere, a pretty small number, just in the few 100,000 here in England, plenty in France, Argentina, but also, Jews in China,
Yeah.
Australia, many places in, Eastern Europe, some in Africa. There's certainly, Ethiopian Jews. There are
Ethiopian. I was
Indian
just going to say,
Jews.
yeah,
Yeah.
from the land
There,
of Cush.
so it's really interesting because when people get this image in their head of, as I said, the kind of the bearded man, and they often think poor pale skin because he's been sitting inside studying all day. That is so small in terms of what Jews are actually like and what we look like and the variety that we have. So yeah, you can think of somebody from Ethiopia, and that definitely doesn't look like the pale white bearded man.
Well, because that kind of brings up an interesting thing. Because to think about, from 70 AD and the destruction of the temple, and then, really kind of, there was a little bit of a there was Masada, and there's a little bit of a rebellion, and then
Yes.
that was it. They flattened the place. And so that was the scattering and diaspora. So many Jews kind of went to Russia and the Russian Caucasus, in that area, but
That's right.
really kind of like some stayed in lands that, are now the Middle Eastern
That's
countries,
right.
Arabic countries, and again, huge, kind of group in Ethiopia. That
Yes.
goes all the way back to the Queen of Sheba.
Mm.
So there's lots of different, groups. So, we talked a little bit about the Ashkenazi, kind of more of
That's
the
right.
European, you know,
Yes.
and then
That's
the
right.
Sephardim, the ones that come from more of the Mediterranean.
That's
And
right,
then
sort
what
of
was it? The
Spain, Greece, and so on. And then the Mizrahi
Mizrahi,
are the
yeah.
ones from the kind of, and, sadly, you mentioned the Middle East and the Mizrahi, and they were expelled. So there are
Yes.
almost no Jews left living in any of those countries. I think I read recently there's one Jewish man living in Yemen still, and he just refuses to leave. It's his homeland. The other, have left. Hopefully I've gotten that statistic right.
No, I
Jews
think you're
have
right.
left Iraq, Iran. I mean, there's a big Iranian Jewish population living in California, because it was not safe for them, especially after, the revolution in the 1970s. there were Jews in basically every what we now think of, or Muslim Middle Eastern countries, and for centuries people lived side by side. I mean,
Right.
sometimes, of course, they had arguments, but often they worked together.
Mhm.
Maybe one was a landlord, the other, rented land. Maybe they ran a business together. I mean, you read of all these stories that they respected each other because Jews, Christians, and Muslims are the Abrahamic religions, and I like to think of them as related religions, but it seems like people have forgotten that today. And
Yeah.
instead it's become this, well, why didn't you give up your religion and convert? Or what's wrong with you? It's kind of this attitude now. So it's really sad when you think about Jews who used to live there and they've had to leave their homelands, their languages,
Yeah.
their homes, and to go live elsewhere because they were kicked out. They were no
Right.
longer acceptable.
Well, and thinking back to the 80s and Reagan and the refuseniks, he got the
Yes,
refuseniks out of Russia. He put a lot of pressure to get them out,
definitely.
and they ended up going to Israel. I remember like reading something they were talking about in Israel. They were having kind of a hard time because all of a sudden they had this huge influx, and they're kind of like, okay, houses, jobs, how are we going
Yes,
to?
that's right. And, I mean, it's just like with any country with immigration, you have to help people assimilate, learn the
Right.
language, yeah, find jobs and homes and so on. And so it's a big deal. But Israel has been really good about trying to kind of expand and accept people from different
Yeah.
places. And they make a huge, they really like praise people and welcome people who are coming to Israel, who we call it making Aliyah when you move home
Aliyah, yeah.
to Israel. Yeah.
Mm,
And they are welcomed and really warmly, I would say, and
mm,
and that's something that's very special versus kind of the attitude that we have in a lot of countries now. It's like, oh, why are these immigrants coming here? It doesn't matter where they're
right.
coming from, it's just what are they doing? And it's a very different attitude to what Israel has, unfortunately. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and I think a lot of people kind of don't really sort of understand that.
No.
So as you said, can we talk a little bit about this kind of spectrum of belief? So we're talking about, that Jewishness is an ethnicity. It is actually
Yes,
something that does show up on ancestry DNA
it
charts and things
does.
like
Yeah.
that. So it is an
Although we should
ethnicity.
point out that people can also convert to being Jewish.
Yes, they can. Yeah,
It's less usual, partially because Judaism is not a proselytizing religion,
right.
so we don't try to convert people. People do choose to convert, a
They do.
surprising number
Yeah.
sometimes, actually. But
Uh,
yes, for many of us. So I was personally, I was a little disappointed when I went to do my DNA, and it just came up 100% Ashkenazi. I was hoping for some sort of family secret that I hadn't known about, but alas, that was not to be.
Well, Ivanka Trump, very, um, well known
Yes,
convert.
convert,
Yes,
absolutely. Yes, you're right.
absolutely.
Mm.
Yeah. So, so it gives you this idea. So people a lot of times don't even really kind of understand that. That
No.
they think, oh, it's just, it's amazing the misunderstandings people have.
Yes.
And
Yes, and
again,
I'm
they think, okay, white, white, blonde hair, blue eye, because they're thinking mostly of kind of the ones that sort of came through Northern Europe, and that's not
yes.
even the whole picture. So it's kind
No.
of like, how can
It's
you be
all part of the
white
picture.
colonizers if you're not
Yeah.
white?
No. No, it doesn't make sense to use that terminology at all because, how can you be a colonizer if you're going back to where your ancestors came from
Right.
and where you were expelled from? That it doesn't it just feels like you're trying to, it's like Cinderella trying to, fit a foot into a shoe that doesn't belong to it. You think of her
Right.
stepsisters in a way, so they're trying to insist that, oh, colonizing is the right description for what's going on there, but it doesn't fit. It's not
Right.
right. And as we said, you can have Jewish as your ethnicity, and that's true for many of us, and you see it in our DNA. You also have the convert, but you also have this kind of range of religious beliefs, and you have, interestingly, as I said before, you have Jews who are atheist or agnostic or humanist, but still really identify strongly with being Jewish.
Right.
The best way I can explain it maybe is for, many American people will say, "Oh, I'm Italian American,
Right.
I'm Chinese
Right.
American," and so you can say, "I'm Jewish American," that because it still matters to you. It's still your food and your cultural background and where
Mm,
your grandparents and great grandparents came from. But then you also get, this kind of range. I feel a little bit bad putting them in this order, but maybe from lowest religiosity to highest religiosity, maybe you have, and there are different terms in different
Right,
countries as
right.
well, but we often think of Reconstructionist and Reform,
Yes.
progressive and liberal, those kind of all loosely fit in the same category. And here in the UK right now, that's undergoing a change, and Reform and Liberal, which were two different
Right,
groups, are now
right.
joining together under a new umbrella. So, we'll have to watch the space to see what that kind of becomes. Um, then you have conservative or Masorti, a little bit more traditional. You've got modern Orthodox, where people kind of hew closely to what the Torah, the
Right,
Bible says,
right.
but also live in conjunction with the modern world. And then you get kind of further with Orthodox and Hasidic and so on, where they maybe separate themselves a little bit more, maybe prefer to live in Jewish neighborhoods and, spend a lot of their day studying Torah and living by the laws, by, the commandments and the mitzvot. And
Right.
yeah, yes. And so it varies hugely. And I think that's one reason why I wanted to write the book as well, was because so many people didn't understand those differences. And I go into it, of course, more in the book, but the distinctions, but how even somebody who perhaps never goes to synagogue, maybe they never set foot in
Right.
synagogue, and yet still is very influenced by their Jewish background and still might choose certain Jewish traditions as a way of honoring
Mm.
their pregnancy or the birth, and following kind of Jewish tradition when it comes to breastfeeding. And I find that really fascinating, how kind of ingrained our ethnic background can kind of be, how much it can shape us.
Well, and I think also too, that's a time when a lot of times people are searching for bigger meaning,
Yes.
and so it could be something that sort of draws, but it's kind of funny because it's like, I think if we were talking in normal times, we would be just kind of looking at this in a cultural competence lens, but it even seems bigger to me right now because it seems like what we're talking about are civil rights.
Yes. Yes, definitely. I mean, I have a story in the book because one of the things I did was interview a lot of Jewish
Right.
people about their experiences. And there was one story of somebody who, they gave birth to a little boy. This was here in the UK,
Yeah.
and said to the midwife, I think the midwife said something like, "Oh, what are you going to call him?" And the person said, "Oh, well, in accordance to tradition, I'll
Right.
name my baby on the eighth day when he's circumcised." And the midwife went and called social services because she, didn't have the knowledge. So that's partially the cultural competence, but also she had, I think, kind of discrimination or kind of anti-Semitic views deep inside her that then were sort of triggered by this news of your tradition on the eighth day. And so what should have been a really happy time for this family turned into an extremely stressful one,
Like
because
nightmare.
yeah, you're having to fend off social services, you're trying to recover from birth, you're trying to establish breastfeeding, you're trying to plan for this special event on the eighth day. And meanwhile, as you say, somebody's trying to rob you of your rights. And it's very worrying. And that's one example. But of course, we have other examples of people whose times are kind of being ruined or being made more difficult because they're not getting the care that they need or that they deserve, really.
Well, you know, um, it's just to me kind of mind blowing about that because I mean, it's not like circumcision is unusual.
No.
In fact, people on the no circ end a lot of times are the ones who are sort of the radicals and stuff. So I mean, this isn't just kind of this out there thing,
No.
and I'm
No,
just stunned.
it is, I mean, it's less common here in the UK, whereas I
Right,
think in the
right.
US it's sort of standard
It is.
80% men, or boys I think are circumcised. It's a lower number here in the UK, but even so, it's
Mm.
certainly not unheard of. It's certainly not that uncommon. Um, but I think in that instance, it was somebody's discomfort with it being Jewish,
Yeah.
and the way it might be done, not, in hospital where your doctor just comes along and does a little snip, but instead as part of a ritual. And it must be said that, this ritual is carried out by highly trained professionals called
Mm.
mohalim.
Right.
Um, but for somebody who's not aware of that, they might envision all sorts of things like, oh my gosh, rusty tools or things that don't get, sanitized properly, or, whatever it is this woman was thinking. But clearly she got bad images in her head and felt the Jews can't have this. This isn't going to happen.
Well, if that woman had showed up in hijab, and was going to
Yes.
circumcise her baby. I mean, would we be having this conversation?
Well, that's a big question. I'm not convinced that we would be, because I mean, partially for the fact that there's so many more Muslims in the world than there are
Right.
Jews, more knowledge, but also I think we nowadays are taught to be more careful around certain groups, and also that we feel certain ethnic or religious groups or ethno-religions are more deserving of respect than others. That seems to be the position that we're in now, and I feel that Jews in particular are being told, "You do not deserve respect, and I'm going to, shout down any of your beliefs and your traditions, and whatever it is wrong and disgusting, and just this week here in the UK, there was a program that came out on the BBC about anti-Semitism. So it was really amazing and surprising that they did it. Actually, it was just a
Yeah.
short 30
That
minutes.
that is surprising.
And especially these days with the BBC. But
Yeah.
a Jewish midwife I know was interviewed on there, and she talked about how while she's going about her work on the wards, helping women give birth,
Mhm.
and the vast majority of people she's helping are not Jewish because we're a
Right.
small minority. People, her patients and their families are calling her baby killer
Mm.
and genocidal maniac and, Zio and other terms, so they're abusing her as she's trying to support them. So, the respect has to go both ways in a sense that you have to treat your clients and your patients respectfully, but also clients and patients have to treat you respectfully. And I can just almost, picture this woman I know and other Jewish, midwives and doctors I know, you know, if it were me, my hands would be shaking, my
Mm.
heart would be racing. How can you give the best treatment to a patient who's talking to you like that? How
Right.
can you feel safe? You would feel, well, I think I would feel nauseated, frightened, wondering, can I be alone in a room with these people?
Right.
Meanwhile, she's on duty and you're supposed to support the person who's giving birth, and yet they're talking to you that way. So it's really horrible. And I think, as you said, if it were somebody from a different ethnic background and, they were your midwife, they would not be having to deal with that sort of abuse in the workplace.
Well, okay, so let's say black woman,
Mhm.
is in there and there's lots of terms that, are highly offensive. Would that be okay? It's
No,
like,
no, no. I mean,
there'd be some conversations, I think,
I
that
think so, because nowadays you see signs almost everywhere you go, in hospitals, but also, for example, last week I was in the vet with my dog, and there's a big
oh,
sign that says, "We don't tolerate any abuse of our staff." And they say that, but are they following through on that? And that's
right,
one thing I'd really like to see, is that people put clear policies into place saying, if we get racist abuse, anti-Semitic abuse, any kind of discrimination, it could be against neurodivergent people, disabled
mm,
people, class system, whatever it is, here's what we do, here's the policy. And I think that everybody needs to know that. But, as we were saying already, when you're giving birth, you are so vulnerable. In that moment, you don't necessarily think, wow, the midwife just said something really insulting to me, I'm going to go make an official complaint.
right.
You don't feel like that. You don't feel safe to do that. And your mind is in another place anyway. And when I've spoken to people who've dealt with something like that, and I've said, well, later on you could go, they go, yes, but the paperwork, and I've got a new baby, and it makes me feel traumatized to have to go through it
Mm,
again and to think about it some more. We want to prevent these things from happening,
well,
not have to deal with them.
and I think we wanna have a shield around that family, that
Yes.
says, "We're gonna protect you from this." But also, I mean, the staff need to be protected. They don't need to be hearing this. This is hard
No.
work, and it's
Yes,
also tends to be rather poorly paid work in compared
it
to other
is.
health professionals, very difficult work, but, not necessarily adequately compensated.
No, it's
And then
women's work, isn't it?
yeah, well, yeah, and then, it's kinda like we stepped in to help because we needed to, and now we're kind of like, well, oftentimes, especially in the breastfeeding world, the part of the team that's not getting paid,
No, no,
and
absolutely. A lot of us, in lactation, I mean, I would say a lot of my work, in breastfeeding is now basically volunteer
yeah,
helping people.
yeah,
People can't maybe afford to pay for it, or I just think, oh, well, I'll just give them a bit of my time just so, and also, of course, I'm not getting as much work anyway because, paid work anyway because of all the anti-Semitism. But exactly as you say, we're stepping in because we're passionate about it. We care about people meeting the breastfeeding goals, and we want to support them. And yet, um,
You don't want
you're,
to be
what are they going to
abused
say
in
to
your
me?
job. Yeah,
No,
that's just not okay ever.
it's
So
not.
it is
Somebody
stunning.
I mean, a Jewish doula I know received an email
Yeah.
where she said, "Look, we're thinking about employing you, but we're thinking about your last name, so we need to know in advance. Are you a Zionist? Because if you are, we're not going any further with this." And you
Okay.
could say, well, on the one hand, it's better that she knew so that she didn't
Mhm.
get involved in working with that family and have to try to hide who she was. But on the other hand, can you imagine getting that message and thinking, well, I have so much knowledge that I could share, that I could use for you on your, birth journey and your breastfeeding journey. And yet, because I believe in Israel's right to exist and to defend itself, you don't want to work with me.
Right.
And that is the world that we're living in at the moment. That's how people are, treating Jewish staff or Jewish, midwives, doulas, lactation consultants, all of us.
It is actually stunning because I mean, like here in the US, we have the Anti-Defamation League has always been
Yes.
pretty boom.
Yes.
You run into something and they're like boom. But I know that the same things are happening here.
Yes.
One of my friends actually is a, Israeli bit professor at
Mm.
Columbia, right in the middle of
Oh,
all that.
wow. Well, that's a
You
tricky
know,
place right now.
it it's been awful for her. I mean, absolutely awful. She sent me a lovely handwritten note, so somebody taking the time to say that and just
Mm.
saying, "Thank you for standing with us." And I was like, "Yeah, of course, no problem."
But
Absolutely.
well, you say no problem, but most people aren't doing it. I mean,
No,
most people are afraid to stand up because I think they're worried what it's going to do to their own career. I mean,
yeah,
sometimes they just disagree, so they wouldn't stand
right,
up anyway.
right.
But sometimes I think people think about it and then they think, well, I can't be the one voice, I can't be seen to associate with that person. But you chose to from your own kind of backbone and your own sense of ethics and
And
courage.
conviction, and
Yeah.
it's like, this isn't right, so I mean, yeah, I understand it kind of. I'm sorry, I banged something here. Early career people, a lot of times they are in a little bit of a predicament, but at a certain point, you have to stand.
You do, yes, yes,
You
and
know,
or you have to live with yourself knowing that you're not somebody who, can, uh, be brave and who can do the right thing, and that's how do you live with yourself knowing
well,
that?
and then you get Vienna
Yes,
and
well, yes,
the
yes.
Nazis marching in. I mean, seriously. Okay, so yeah, we talked about kind of like where Jewish people live, and you said about half are in Israel, half are in the
Mhm.
U.S., and then scattered kind of through other
Yes.
countries. There's been lots of migration from these other places.
Oh,
You know,
yes, I
just
mean, we have been all over the place, we still are all over the
yeah,
place, but I think more and more people are, as we said, thinking about returning to Israel. Is that the one safe place? But Israel isn't even that safe either, so,
right.
where will we be safe? Maybe we all need to go to Mars or something, then people would be happy if we were elsewhere.
Well, it's interesting because I read Robert Spencer's very long and very hard to read book on anti-Semitism, and he was actually saying he said something kind of interesting. And in this book, nobody gets off the hook for this. He just goes through all the history, and it is awful.
Mhm.
And speaking as a Christian woman, Catholics, Protestants, terrible, terrible. There were individuals always, but
Mm.
organized, very bad track record, both sides.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
I want to hang my head in shame for that because that just disgusts me. But I
But
mean,
I
it was
think
hard to read, but I could see it.
Yeah. But I think
One
that's humans, unfortunately, we love to, other
well,
people, and we
we
love to
definitely
divide
do
it to
that.
us and them. Yeah.
But, one of the things that he said that I thought was interesting, so see what you think about this. He said, it was amazing how even after being scattered for 2,000 years from their homeland, that Jewish people have managed to still be Jewish. They
Mm.
didn't disappear.
No.
And he said he thinks one of the reasons, and again, he was not for this, but he said this could be something that was a product of the persecution. Because like even in times like think about Europe when people tried to assimilate. Like I was thinking about Theodor Herzl. We just watched a uh, documentary about him. The founder of Zionism, but
Yes,
he
yes.
was a fully assimilated Jew, and then he
Mm.
witnessed the Dreyfus trial in France.
Yes, that's right.
And then all these protests started going on, and he was like, Europe is getting not safe. So he, recognized that in the late 1800s.
Mm.
And then of course became he was the, sort of founder of Zionism.
Yes.
So, but I mean, this idea that this recognition, but what Robert Spencer said is he said the fact that even times when people have tried to quote, assimilate, they always get sort of outed, but it's kept an identity even after massive persecution, massive death, massive horrible things. There's still a Jewish people after 2,000 years. And I mean, that was really a miracle.
I guess, to a certain extent, when you know that other people don't like you, you feel a tendency to hold on to that identity and to stick with others like you for better or for
Yeah.
worse. And, to some extent, there have been great things that have come out of Jewish culture,
Oh,
but
fantastic.
also it's, a sad commentary on how we've been treated, that we have had to stick so closely together. I mean, one of the reasons why you can trace our DNA so closely is because we have kind of kept in our small communities, intermarried, and that has, the downside, of course, that we have more, genetic illnesses, just like any kind of
Right,
intermarrying
right.
group. But it has, exactly as you said, I think, made us have a strong identity. And, several people that I've spoken to, for the book have said things like, well, the first thing I do when I move to a new place is find the synagogue
Yeah.
or find a synagogue there if there are multiple ones and join it because I need, even if they're not religious, again, in terms of their observance, I need to be with other Jewish people. I need to know where I can go to be safe and to be myself. And I think that's really interesting that people can think, well, actually, I don't want to go to services on Shabbat, but I want to go to the other events at the synagogue because I want to be near other Jewish people, people who get
You want
me.
to observe Yom Kippur and
Exactly, the high
Rosh
holy days,
Hashanah.
or,
Yeah, yeah.
but, to know that, well, at least I'm safe here, which is sad because when you think about safety for Jews, we're, the only religious group with, security uh, outside of our places of worship all the time. We
Yeah,
do, some groups certainly have it at different times, depending on what's going on in the world, but you cannot get into a synagogue today
right.
without, passing security guards, maybe having your ID checked. My family and I were recently in Bulgaria,
Mm.
and Bulgaria knows had many different religious groups. And my younger daughter and I went, and in one day we waltzed into the Catholic Church and enjoyed
Yeah.
seeing that and the priest there. We then went to the Eastern Orthodox Church, and again, we just walked
Mm.
right in. We looked around, the frescoes, the icons, all of it. We then went to the mosque, and we were sent upstairs to the women's
Right,
area, but even
right.
so, we got to go in, we got to see it and learn a bit about it, and then we went to see the synagogue, which is one of the biggest Sephardic
Right.
synagogues in Europe. And to even think about getting in, we had to press a button, answer questions about why we were there, what we wanted to do there. And then a security guard came out, checked our passports, asked us questions. I happened to be wearing a Star of David, so that did help. And and I could say, and I look like some people's stereotypical idea of a Jew. And and my daughter has a Jewish first name, and we have a Jewish surname, so that helped. But then we had to go in, fill in some stuff, and then we were allowed in.
Wow.
And it was a totally different experience from the other places, and it felt really sad because there was so much of interest in the
Right.
synagogue. It was gorgeous. They had exhibits that, you could have a little app and hear about the history, but that was not available to most people because most people aren't willing to go through that. And I think
Right.
most people aren't aware that to go to Shabbat services, we're having to pass through security and explain what we're doing there. And on your day of, your day of rest. And that's very different from most other religious groups these days.
I was just thinking about, I went to both the Grand Synagogue. Well, we went to all the synagogues in Prague.
Oh,
There's
yes.
kind of different history and very interesting. The
Mhm.
Grand Synagogue in Budapest, gorgeous place. I mean, and stood in that yard and I felt such sorrow,
Yes. Oh,
such sorrow. Their Jewish population was pretty much wiped out. I mean, you can't help but feel that. And I kind of
mm.
wonder, because we again just, paid an admission and went in, but no security and stuff. I wonder that probably assume that that has changed. You know,
Yeah, maybe it has. Or
and
maybe they also thought, well, there are no Jews here, so they don't need to be kept safe. It's just a building to us now. Maybe that was how they felt. I don't know. But
possibly.
but it could also have changed depending on, when you compare.
expecting things. But yeah, I know one of my good friends here, she told me that her synagogue and the school that they use, that the Jewish school that her kids go to, said is actually on the same property as a church.
Mm.
And so they actually, kind of trade. And so there are police officers in that church that are a member of the congregation. And so they come on Saturday. I mean, this was before all this crazy stuff broke out.
Mhm.
They come on Saturday and guard and they guard the school. And she said, it's such a, and I'm listening to this and I thought that's the way it should be,
Yeah.
you
But
know,
to think, those children going to
right,
school or going to services, and that becomes their norm of, "Oh, yeah,
right,
other people hate us so much that they wanna injure us, we have to have security
right.
guards," and, I mean, that's kind of a horrific
It
thought
it is, and she was telling
and
it
to be
now
teaching
the
our
way it is.
children.
She's, like, taking their kippas off before they go leave, and she said, "It's just awful,"
Yeah.
terrible, and that's actually in the Washington, DC area.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's pretty bad. So, again, we've kinda talked a little bit about, what are some of the barriers to Jewish women, Jewish parents getting the appropriate support.
Yeah, and I think I do want to believe, as I said before, that most of it is due to ignorance, that
Yeah,
people just aren't aware that, oh, Jewish people might have particular practices when they're pregnant or when they're breastfeeding or whatever. I think, and that's why I want people who aren't Jewish to read the book because I want
right,
them to learn. It's true that in some cases, some of the horrible cases we've spoken about, that barrier is their own,
right.
their prejudice, and I would absolutely suggest that we can all challenge our own biases and our own
Mm,
prejudices. However, I also think there's some people who are unwilling to, who don't want to face that and who are just, they like being, on a particular side. They like, feeling like they're right, by right, I mean correct, not on the right. And they like, the sense of having, a scapegoat I think some people really do feel that way, but I want to believe that the majority of people would like to do what's right for their patients or the clients, and they just don't know how. They're not aware of these things. And so I would like there to be, workshops, and I'd like people to read my book
yeah,
and other books, and to just educate themselves in the way that, um, they would do about another group. I mean, just today I saw that Doula UK, which is the big umbrella group for
mm,
doulas here in the UK, a group that I left actually due to anti-Semitism,
right,
but
right.
they offer cultural competence training for Muslim families, for LGBTQ plus
Mhm,
families, and for neurodivergent. We in our Jewish birth workers organization have offered to run Jewish cultural competence, and they've not taken us up on it. They've
yeah,
not been interested. And I feel like people should want to learn as much as you can about any group, because, the truth is, I think that most of us have more in common than we have that
right,
divides
right.
us. And so, if you're talking about breastfeeding, well, it works the same for the vast majority of people. And, if you've done your lactation consultant, training, for
Mm,
example, you've learned about breastfeeding and how it works physically and about emotionally and so on. But there are certain beliefs that different groups
yeah,
have around it, and therefore you need to have, I would say, some training into those different groups and what it means for
right.
them. And it doesn't seem like that should be a controversial idea, but somehow it is.
Well, and I think actually, something that one of my friends said, and, this kind of brings up with the conversation that we're having is, I think hospital policies, the people at the top need to start making some policies. They need to step in here and do the
Mhm.
right thing, and
Definitely.
say, you keep your political stuff out of this office.
Yes, I
No
agree.
pens, no signs, no nothing. This is
No.
this is going to be a neutral place.
It should be. And, then people will argue, yes, but the personal is political. And you think, yes, yes, of course it is. However, we don't need to go into, who you're going to vote for, or what you think
Right,
is right happening in another part of the world or any of that. This is not the space for it. This is the space, exactly as you said, for neutral care, care that's the same for everybody, regardless of your background or where you come from. The only thing that I would say that should be different is if somebody has, religious or
mhm,
ethnic, traditions that you need to hew to. And but generally, it's kind of the same stuff. I mean, I remember when I was doing, some breastfeeding volunteer work, and somebody said, "I'm Muslim, And in our tradition, we only breastfeed up to 2 years max. And my husband is really pressuring me to stop. And I want to keep going. And what can I do? Because I think that in my tradition, I'm supposed to
Mm.
stop, And so for me, it was like, okay, well, I can talk about, weaning if I want. I can
Right,
also talk
right,
about how you can withstand pressure, because those are things that are, that many people have experienced. However, for her, it was really important to discuss the nitty-gritty of her faith,
right.
her culture, what she thought it was saying, what her husband thought it was saying, and if there was some way that she could explain to him that she had a different perspective on it and she thought, that actually the
Right.
Quran was encouraging or their Muslim faith was encouraging of continuing breastfeeding. So in that instance, it did matter what her background was. But
Right.
I think for most people we support, it probably doesn't matter. And we should, as you said, go in without showing our politics and our beliefs. And we shouldn't ask other people to have to prove theirs either. Like, the person who was told, oh, you're a Zio. I'm not, I don't want you as my midwife or whatever, that shouldn't be part of it.
You know, first of all, I'm sort of dazzled by that example
Mm.
because this Muslim woman, who many would consider on the other side, came to you and you two were able to sit and kind of discuss, okay, and the respect that you showed for her faith,
Mm.
was, I think, pretty amazing. And I think a great example. You sat down and you listened to her, you heard what she said, and you realized actually there's some commonalities. What
Mm.
she believes is, it's not completely different, not completely the same, but I mean, there's some commonalities there, and
Yes.
some of the rituals and stuff, there's some common ground. But you listen to what she said, kind of helped her kind of tease out everything, especially in this charged environment that we found ourselves. So, I'm so impressed by what you did there.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, that particular example happened before the 7th October, so I don't know whether she would have come to me and talked to me, after that. I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm,
But
judging,
still,
but
I
but s
mean,
but,
yeah,
but at the time, there was no doubt that I was Jewish, she was Muslim, and I was somebody that she felt, yeah, she could come to and talk about breastfeeding with, and I was pleased to help her and support her, and she did carry on breastfeeding, I want to say. Um, which was good because that really mattered to her. And you know yourself that, supporting people to meet their breastfeeding goals is something that has an impact on them for the rest of their lives.
yeah.
So that really, mattered to me, and I hope it mattered to her. But I feel like it shouldn't be, unusual that we listen to somebody and try to see them for who they are and where they are and support them, without putting our own views on them. If I'd just gone to her and said, well, it doesn't matter what your husband thinks, it's your body, do what you
Right,
want, that wouldn't
right,
have worked,
right.
because that was not the position she was coming from.
Yeah, and that would be not respectful of what she believed, and, so,
Mhm.
I mean, I think you provided great care, and I think that's an example, and it's like, I think I would like to see this profession behave like that, but
Yes.
unfortunately, right now, I don't know what's going on. It's kind of like there's something in the water. Everybody's gone insane.
Yes, unfortunately, I think, and you were talking about seeing that in the world of psychology, and we talked
Yeah,
about academia, and I think we could name field after field. The publishing industry is another one where, unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of anti-Semitism. I'm seeing Jewish authors who can't get published and, who are struggling. Um, it's a whole other issue that we could talk about, but I feel like it's really sad because it's an indictment of us as a society these
oh,
days
big
that we're
time.
willing to listen to each other
Well,
and
I
come together with respect.
I had somebody come to me as a journal editor and
Mm.
actually asked me kind of back channel, my colleague in Israel, and she's Israeli too, but she said, my colleague in Israel, it's this paper he wants to send, but he's not sure if you're going to be okay with that. And I said, well, okay, let me tell you, we got a little routine here. Yes, I sent that to somebody who is, I have some associate editors who I think would probably not necessarily give that a chance, but I had, one in particular that I knew would be fair, not a rubber
Mm.
stamp. But I was just kind of like, "Look, come on in," and when I first got that approach, I was kind of shocked. But
Mhm.
then I started hearing that from other people, and I thought, "That is ridiculous."
Yeah.
'Cause, I mean, first of all, there's a ton of really good scholarship that comes out of Israel.
Yes,
You
absolutely.
know,
Lots of interesting inventions, and people who wanna boycott Israel maybe should put down their
inventions and,
phones, stop
all
using their
kinds of
mobile
things.
phones.
Yeah, agriculture, supplying of Europe with, fruits and vegetables and flowers. I
Definitely.
mean,
Yes.
so I mean, a lot of things people don't know, but I mean, it seemed, I mean, that it was even affecting the academic world,
Yes.
because the
Yeah, and the
academic world I came up when almost everybody I knew was Jewish. And it's like, what has happened?
no, and I think it's odd because you'd think in academia we would want the free exchange of ideas, but that
Yeah,
is not what's happening.
it's
Instead,
not,
it's
that's not
we
true.
we we want ideas, but not from those people. And when my field in academia is called translation studies, and so
Mm.
people translate books, so it's part of literature.
Oh, yeah.
And there was a big journal in my field, and the editor got virulently anti-Semitic, and she kicked all Israelis who off the editorial board for this journal. She wouldn't publish any Jewish or Israeli authors. She also ran a publishing company. This was, years ago when I was starting off in academia, and I had submitted a book proposal to them because they were such a big publisher. And I got quite odd interactions from her. And then, of course, it was a no. And I did find another publisher for that particular book. But it was an odd situation where it was like we want to learn more, we want new ideas, we're about translation, which is literally cross-cultural communication, and yet you're saying none from that country, none from that type of person, because I don't like their politics. And it's like, you don't know what people's individual politics are. Lots of Israelis
Right.
living in Israel don't necessarily agree with Benjamin Netanyahu, wouldn't
Yeah.
vote for him, and so on. And yet, and of course, Jews outside of Israel mostly can't vote in Israel,
Right. Right.
and people don't know what we think anyway, and yet they're just assuming that because of our background, we must all be of a certain type. It's like assuming, all redheads all think a certain thing,
Right.
and it's just not true, and we seem to have lost sight of that.
Well, and I know there's an expression in Israel, two Jews, three opinions. There's a lot of,
Yes, totally. No, that's
there's a lot of
totally true.
argument back and forth. I mean, so it's like to think everybody's just like lockstep,
No.
is just like ignorant of the culture. But I
We're
mean,
really welcoming of arguing, actually. I mean, if as long as
yeah,
it's respectful, and they often suggest that, so if you and I were gonna debate a topic and we have different views, that I actually maybe try to debate what your perspective might be. So try
right.
to see it from your point of view. And I think that's very helpful for healthy debate, actually.
It absolutely is. So I think kind of the last question, and we've touched on this quite a bit, is to kind of sum up, what particular things can doctors and midwives and doulas and IBCLC do to support the Jewish community? It seems like honestly, the first one is keep your politics out of
Yes.
practice.
Definitely. I think that's true, and I think that's good for everybody, regardless of
Yes.
if it's about the Middle East or any other, what's your view on the reunification of Ireland, for example? So
Right.
Northern
Oh my
Ireland,
gosh.
part of the UK, we don't need to talk about that in the
And
hospital. That's
and
not
talk
relevant
about
there.
people who can keep a grudge.
Yes, yeah, yeah, absolutely.
But I mean, how would
Um,
it be if a Protestant nurse wouldn't treat a Catholic patient?
Yeah, people would not accept that, would they? They would,
No.
you would immediately be, okay, we're suing, we're taking a case. And,
Mhm.
so definitely, I think, as you said, keeping politics out of the space. I also think something we talked about in terms of having clear policies for
Right.
here's how we're going to handle abuse.
Mhm.
But also, I just really want to see people educate themselves more. You can be respectful and say, I don't know, what can you tell me about your tradition? Or can you tell me what matters to you in the postpartum period?
Right.
Work out a plan with somebody, okay, so you're coming to this hospital, you're going to give birth. What do we need to know? Oh, okay, you won't press the elevator button on
Right.
Shabbat.
Right.
Could we have somebody who could help you with that? Or, how can we override? Or, oh, you need kosher food. How can we,
Right.
it doesn't have to be a big thing like, oh, that's disgusting, that's weird, but you don't need to be negative about it, but
Right.
just be curious and open, and willing to hear more. And I'd really love to see, all hospitals, all kind of doctors' practices have an hour-long session, let's say, on Jewish cultural competence, the way they
Right.
might have, a brown bag
Right.
lunch or a workshop on something else, just to say, you know what, we don't know that much about this group. It's a very small minority. We'd like to learn a little bit more. Oh, okay. A lot of them like to, pray as they're giving birth, or they like to have a red, thread, because that's sort of
Right.
a slightly superstitious but tradition for some Jews.
Kind of
Um,
the Kabbalah, yeah, with the
yeah,
red
yeah,
thread, yeah,
and,
yeah.
oh, okay, so we understand why they're putting that up in the birthing room, or, whatever it might be. And just to just to educate ourselves a little bit more. And I think we all would do so well to learn more about different groups and to see what our commonalities are rather than always focusing on our differences. And saying, okay, maybe I don't believe in this thing they do, but they're doing it and I'm going to respect them and I'm going to help make that happen for them. So, they don't want to say the name of their baby, whether it's a boy or girl until 8 days. That's fine. I won't ask that. Oh, they're not going to fill in the paperwork on Shabbat because that's considered doing work.
Right.
We can do it on Sunday. What's the issue, or after sundown on a Saturday.
Right.
So I just would really love to see more kind of acceptance and respect for different groups, kind of across the board. And in terms of us Jews, many of us are feeling frightened, and I'd like to feel comforted and accepted. I was in a doula group, and somebody started saying very horrible anti-Semitic things. And I started writing some stuff back, but in a very calm, I tried to be very calm and say, this is why it's incorrect. This is why, it's harmful. And all these people jumped on me. Nobody did what you did and stood up for me. Nobody sent me even a private message to say, I see how hard that is. I wish I could speak up, but I can't right now. It was just, and then it was, I'm blocking you. You're disgusting. The genocide, all of that. And I just wish that we could have these spaces, whether they're for doulas or lactation consultants, psychologists, whichever group we're in, where we can talk about things, and we're not making it about identity politics.
Well, and it's also about you did these things, and that makes no sense. I would really encourage, if people want to kind of educate themselves. One book I think you and I talked about before is, Douglas Murray. Now he's somebody who, Murray that's an Irish name.
Yeah, he's not Jewish.
In some ways, he has some, no skin in the game here, but he is an observer. He's a keen observer, and he wrote a wonderful book called On Democracies and Death Cults, and it really kind of goes through, not only the events of October 7th in really horrible detail, but then the things that started the day after, the protests and stuff before Israel had lifted the hand. But I mean, if you want to kind of like educate yourself a little bit about it, maybe just hear the other side.
Yes.
That would be a good one to read, because he is coming kind of from a neutral source. He's a gay man. He's of Irish descent living in England. He's a Brit. But it's an excellent book. He's a very thoughtful writer. I've actually read several of his books. But that would be one, I think, that would be, really helpful.
Definitely. And I think, just recognizing that, okay, maybe I don't know the full story, because there are a lot of people speaking up who, in all honesty, they know nothing about the history. They're jumping on bandwagons or they're making assumptions and they don't really know. So anything you can do to educate yourself is beneficial in kind of all arenas of life, but especially here where we're seeing this massive growth of anti-Semitism. It could help you and it could help Jewish people, and it could help you be, better in whatever it is you're doing, if you're a doctor or doula, midwife, whatever the field is.
Well, I think, and also too, if you want to educate yourself on Israel, on the current Israel history, Robert Spencer's book on anti-Semitism, very good. As I said, difficult read. Had to skip off and read a few rom-coms in between because it's hard reading. But I mean, he writes beautifully and it's all documented. But if you want to just skip to the end, you can kind of see there's a history there, and you'll see it laid out. Again, somebody with no skin in the game. He's a historian.
Yes.
And so he's writing really neutrally about kind of the events. First with the Balfour Declaration, and then you got the events of World War II, the British mandate in Palestine, and then eventually, how there were the two states. So he gives kind of I think, an accurate history that I think is really missing. A lot of people chant stuff that they don't understand what they're saying.
Yes.
And
no,
so
I think you're right.
To me, it's kind of like, I kind of started like looking at your book when I first read it, and I felt like I was fairly educated about Jewish culture, but I found myself learning a lot.
Oh,
I learned a lot in this book. So there are many things, that this is a very interesting book. And I want to say BJ is absolutely a fabulous writer.
Oh.
She has a lyric style. She'll just pull you right in. She really does a wonderful job. So I really want to recommend her book. And again, like I said, in case you missed Be Fruitful, there it is. This is the one you want. You see that beautiful Hamsa symbol there.
Well, it's a beautiful cover. I'm really, really happy with it. I think it's gorgeous.
Yeah, I love the little mom and baby in the middle there. It's so
Yeah,
cute.
it's
It's so
great.
cute.
It's great.
But again, a kind of a nice history. So, originally I thought we were going to talk about, okay, how do you respect cultures and stuff? But it seems like there is a bigger issue, which is
Mm,
how are we keeping these awful politics
mm,
out of these spaces so that we can make it safe for our providers and for our families? How can we do
mm,
that? And so I want to call on everybody who is not Jewish, stand up. It's time. It's
mhm.
time. We've got to make this safe. This isn't right. Okay, politically you may totally disagree with me. That's fine. Okay? That's fine. I'll respect that. I think we don't necessarily have to talk about it. But this thing is not right.
No,
You wouldn't do this with any other group. I mean, Chinese mother came in, just because you're mad at the Chinese Communist Party, you wouldn't treat her like dirt.
no,
You
no.
wouldn't. I would really hope that you wouldn't. I know a lot of Chinese nationals that live here in the US. That would be a terrible, terrible thing to do. So,
Mm,
what's happening in the Middle East does not pertain to this particular woman. She's not involved in this. Her family is not involved in this. This is, do your
yeah.
job. Do
I
your
mean, I
job.
think see the individual before you. Don't see the kind of their whole culture. And in a sense, you need to know their culture, but don't judge them for their background or for their culture. And where we're born, who we're born is chance. And
Chance.
people seem to forget that. And they think that, you've chosen something and you've chosen to be deliberately provocative. I mean, somebody faced anti-Semitic abuse walking down the street, and then people said, well, it was his fault. He was openly Jewish because he was
Oh,
wearing his
geez.
yarmulke. You think, no, you don't blame the victim. No, that's not okay. And I think that's what people are doing. So I think you're absolutely right. See the person in front of you and don't discriminate. Treat them as you would treat other people.
Right.
We
And
just
then,
need
I see
respectability.
Ben Shapiro is funny because, of course, he is Orthodox Jewish and he's wearing his yarmulke. And, people are calling him a Nazi. And he's like, yeah, that's rich. See this on my
Yeah.
head?
Oh, that's
But I
horrible.
mean, he's been dealing with that for a long time. But
Yes, for
this
sure.
thing right now I'm really calling on everybody who is not Jewish. It's time to stand up for our colleagues. It's time to stand up for our patients. We have to do it.
Thank you so
It
much for
it is
saying
an
that.
imperative. This is not okay. We wouldn't do this with any other group. Why is it okay to do this right now? It's terrible. And I would encourage you, please educate yourself. I know everybody always says that about every single group, but if you can kind of learn to see it from the other perspective, at the very least, you'll learn something. You'll learn some
Mhm.
history. The history around this area is very interesting. No kidding. But I would encourage, please, keep this a safe space. Keep your politics out of it. I know this is a jagged time, and I know people will come to blows over this stuff, but honestly, there's no place for it. Stop it.
Yeah,
So,
I agree.
BJ, thank you for being brave and standing up to this.
Thank you.
And I hope that, you continue to find, I know you're kind of isolated from the colleagues in London who have been a safe space for you. But I
Yes,
mean,
right.
these are treacherous times,
They are.
but I think
Yes.
it's time for people to stand up.
And I think, we talked a lot about, the book and it being useful for those who aren't Jewish, but I also want to say that I want it to be a safe space for Jewish readers too, who
Yes.
can look at it and think, wow, I see myself reflected, or
Right.
I've gotten some new ideas. I've gotten some information about my own group. I've spoken to Jewish readers who maybe weren't so religious, and they said, "Oh, I didn't know that the more
Right.
observant did this,"
Right.
So we all kind of need both to be educated and also to have places where we can see ourselves reflected. And I hope I've provided that to a certain extent in my
I
book.
think you really actually have. Again, like I said, I found myself learning a lot. And I was like, "Oh, wow." And it's like there's a lot of Hebrew words in here, and I was kind of struggling as an editor trying to think, okay, should normally you italicize, words
Yeah.
that are from another language, but bar and bat mitzvah, we know what those are. So,
Yes,
we
that's
don't
right.
tend to italicize those, but there's a lot of interesting just history, culture in here. I think you'd be fascinated, and you'll see the spectrum,
Yes.
so, but at the very least, God, Dad, we got to make this safe.
Thank you
That's our
so
priority
much.
right now.
Oh, I really appreciate you saying that.
So I want to say thank you all for tuning in. Definitely recommend BJ's book, Be Fruitful. And it's actually, I'm reading the subtitle here, so I make sure I get it right. The Jewish Pregnancy and Birth Guide. And
Yes.
really, again, it's history, it's culture. It kind of gives just an idea. But also, I think what we've heard here is, there's a bigger issue, and that is we need to keep, these families and these providers safe, and it's time for us to stand up. This is the right thing to do. So with that, I'm going to say thank you very much for tuning in to the Sounds Chick Report, and that's me slapping my clipboard again. And until next time.
Thanks so much.